Good evening. And so sorry for this technical hiccup. Hey, good evening. Welcome to this first duo lecture. It's part of the Going Public program of the Faculty of Architecture of the KU Leuven campus, St. Lucas, Brussels, and Ghent. As you know, some of you might joined this lecture series before. The Going Public lecture series are an outreach program from the Faculty of Architecture in which we try to create a community, try to stimulate debates on and through architecture. Normally we invite external guests from all different fields to bring an interesting program, but we thought that also outreach means showing and sharing what expertise, what knowledge, what competences are present at the faculty itself, formed by obviously students, but also teaching staff. And duo stands for, maybe I have to say something else first. You know also that at the Faculty of Architecture, we organize the master design studio environments in what we call engagements, families of design studios. And there are 5 such engagements. We have mediating tactics, of which there was a lecture last week. We have urban cultures, we have legacy, and then we have craftsmanship and the Brussels way. And with me, and you see him here on my left, maybe on the screen your right, is Patrick Moyerson, the curator of the Brussels Way engagement, and I myself am Thomas Ooms, curating the craftsmanship engagement. And the duo lecture series, they are here to combine 2 practitioners, 2 teachers, 2 professors from the faculty, but also 2 of the engagement, because of course we understand that the engagements are a way of temporarily creating a framework in which studios fit or move around or move in. But also, I think there are opportunities for synergies and for, I guess, also enriching contaminations. And I think that is what we will witness and join tonight with the visual conversation between Harold Fallon and Doc Allard. Harold Fallon is an architect, teacher, and he's one of the partners of AgwA Architecture Office here based in Brussels. And Doc Allard is architect and collaborator at Xavier de Geerter Architects, also based in Brussels. And that also gives us the opportunity to highlight Brussels as an interesting biotope for architectural practices. They gladly accepted the invitation to this first duo lecture and seized also the opportunity to, we seized the opportunity to also, there was a message popping up, so I was trying to utter sentences and read the message at the same time, which doesn't always work very well. Anyway, they seized the opportunity to not give 2 separate lectures, but actually engage in a visual conversation, a sort of a visual ping pong between 2 practitioners, and they will use photos, images, references, projectors in a kind of 7-way ping pong. I think, Harold, you are letters and Doug is numbers, or it's the other way around. Doug is letters and Harold is numbers. And well, I think without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Harold Fallon and Doc Allard, and maybe you can turn on your camera so that they can see you. By the way, we're sharing the same room, we're sitting opposite sides. Hi there, guys. Welcome.
Hi, sure.
And please, the floor is yours.
Shall I share the screen?
Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah. Hello, everybody, whoever that may be. I'm talking to a screen here. I find it very interesting, this idea of a dual conversation. I think conversations are important in a school of architecture. They're important in architecture. I think architecture isn't alone, it is a dialogue. And so I think it's nice in some ways to have a visual dialogue between two people. We've not rehearsed this, so it's interesting to see how it goes, but I think it's very nice that there's a reaction between the different images that we propose. I started, so this is my first image, it's one single image. And the question for me was, what do you start with? Do you start with a building that you've done? Do you start with a piece of very prescriptive or descriptive architecture? This is actually a work of art. It's an installation. It's a photograph of an installation in Antwerp by Matta-Clark. I think it's both beautiful. I think it's beautifully crafted. It was an existing building in Antwerp, which was due to be demolished. And Matta-Clark, 40 years ago, was asked to make an intervention in this building before it was demolished. So the only thing that exists of his intervention are some photographs. In the end, people were not even allowed to visit the building. And in truth, it's also somewhat of a lie, because his intention was to cut the existing building, as you see, these semicircles, but because of building permissions, he was not allowed to, so it's actually on canvas. So it's both, it's even more of a fabrication. What I find very beautiful and interesting about this image is, firstly, it's an artwork. And I think sometimes in architecture, artwork is a perfect vehicle to discuss themes and topics, because art doesn't necessarily have to answer a question that architecture does. It just can provide the opportunity, it raises questions. So I think that's a very interesting thing to start a conversation where we don't know where it's going to go. The second thing is, I think it's a beautiful example of using something existing and changing it, making something extraordinary. So you have something very plain, and in some ways with little intervention, you made something other. In this case, it's my art. And lastly, it's about reuse, which I think is a topic. I mean, I think you can read as much in as you wish, but I think it says something about why did this building get knocked down in the first place. Okay, that's my first part.
Thank you. I was wondering first if I should react on the artwork itself or on the advertisement. It says that money doesn't grow on trees, but on roer and erfgoed, in real estate. But then, of course, the strength of the image with a very formal intervention, but that is at the same time related to action and to maybe also displacement of material, made me think of all kinds of actions that you can see on construction sites, like the digging of holes to make the foundations, for example, that are not meant to stay or have no use, but they have some kind of very strong presence. During demolitions also, at once the spatiality of a building completely changed. The light also evolves. But then sometimes this kind of heaps of movements of material also are there because of utilitarian goals. Like here it's a slope that the contractor made in order to be able to access the building, because there is a difference of height. Then sometimes this is in a project that is nearby here, where we refurbished a school. It was an office building which became a school, and then there was the topic of reuse was quite important, because we had lots of interesting materials inside the building itself. And then the storage becomes a question, and then we have this kind of heaps of mineral wool that inhabit the space in a kind of funny way. And then sometimes the heaps or this kind of movements of materials, they also become something expressive in the project itself. This is the exhibition palace in Charleroi, Palais des Expositions, in which we just removed the facades of the central part of the building. So it reveals the diversity of the structures, of course. But then also what appears quite strongly is the natural slope that flows through the building. And we rework slightly the slopes in order to invite the slope deeper in the building. But I feel there is something that resonates maybe with somehow the work of Gordon Matta-Clark. And then last, this is a picture from an artist, to come back to art, Lara Armasegui. She has an artistic practice in which she investigates topics that are related to architecture and infrastructure, industry also. And then she realized this kind of heaps of materials in artistic contexts, but also photographic surveys. And I was reading a text written in the framework of an exhibition of hers, and in which it is stated that before the Industrial Revolutions, the economy was pretty much based on a surfacic approach. So all the resources were on the surface of the earth, the woods, the fields, the crops and the animals. And so there was a kind of sense of the limits of the resources. But then arrived the science of geology and mining resource with the coal and the iron. And this gave a sense of illimitation of the resources, which is of course kind of problematic today. And maybe the idea that in the reuse logics, when you start approaching the existing buildings that are on the surface as a resource for action, then you are going back to this kind of approach of economy in which the resources are limited and on the surface of things.
Great. It's back to me. Obviously, I was delighted with this, your choice, because of course it was our first attempt, and we thought, oh my goodness, how is this going to work? But again, the next image I've chosen is an artwork. Again, as with Gordon Matta-Clark, it's somebody who trained as an architect. This is Francis Ponge. He's actually Belgian, born in Antwerp, now lives, I believe, in Mexico. Obviously, the reference of, let's say, this is a hill, it's a non-man-made construct, it's a piece of landscape, it's a physical thing. These are two images of a performance art piece he carried out in Peru. I saw this, it's again a little bit like Gordon Matta-Clark, it doesn't actually exist. I mean, the hill exists, but let's say the intervention does not. It's a performance piece asking questions. He asked 500 people from a village in Peru to together with each with a shovel for one day to move a mountain. And they physically, I mean, it's almost an allegory, it's a joke to an extent, but they physically, for a whole day, went up the entire one side of a mountain with shovels, shifting the earth, and then down the other side. And so in principle, in theory, you could argue that after a day, they had moved the mountain half a meter. It's both ridiculous and beautiful. I think I have to say, if anybody has the chance, please look at the film. I think it's about 20 minutes. It's on the website of Francis Ponge. It's unbelievably engaging. Why I think it's relevant and why I think it's also interesting to architecture, I think it seems very simple, it seems almost mundane, but it's actually engaging in a political sphere, and it's saying something about who's the ownership of landscape, I think. what collectively can be done, who owns public space, who owns it, and how people can shape public space. And these are not even the only things which I think Francis Elise was intending to do. So I find it really engaging, that idea that to an extent, architecture is an art, can very often be political as well as beautiful. This is another artwork again, working in the landscape. This is Jan Dries, another Belgian architect. This is in the Middelheim Park on the outskirts of Antwerp, and it was first built in the 1970s. It's an almost minimalist piece. I think it's extremely beautiful. It's a tilted landscape. So in a way, what he did was, in a beautiful park landscape, he created something artificial. And by creating something artificial, he created a place within a space. I also really like the fact that he's also physically doing it himself. I think the craftsmanship of making is beautifully done. What I forgot, because I lived in Antwerp 20 years ago, that his piece, which was built as an artwork, was actually transferred to the public realm. So they built a 3 times larger version of meditative meditative space. They built it in a square in Antwerp, and it was there for 25 years as a piece of public infrastructure. You could sit on it, you could skateboard on it, you could do various things on it. It had performances, they had concerts there, and eventually it was demolished when the square was redeveloped in the 2007-8. And as a last story for the work of Jan Dries, they recreated several years ago in Middelheim, because Jan Dries passed away, and I think they wanted to commemorate his work, which now no longer existed, but only in memory. They recreated this artwork. So in a way, what is beautiful, it's been an artwork, it's been a piece of public infrastructure, and it's been an artwork again, and now it's gone. So I think there's a transitory nature about what is permanent and what is not. Perhaps to link it more back to directly to the work of our practice, we work a lot on public space, particularly in cities, rather than exclusively on buildings. This is the Schumann Plain in Brussels at the top of the Rue de la Loi, which is a competition which we won 10 or 11 years ago. If anybody knows the space, it's not a square, it's a traffic roundabout. There was a competition which we won, and it's been a long story. You can read in the internet about it if you wish, but we proposed effectively, again, it's a little bit an artistic move. What do? You sit there with nothing. You sit there with an open space which doesn't really work, and what can you do? And I think what we can do as architects is we can solve some problems, and then we can let things happen. So the intention is that this tilted surface allows for meetings, it allows for demonstrations, it allows for concerts, and then everything underneath solves the problems. We got rid of the cars, we put the parking underneath, we made the connections to the metro from this installation, and also there was bike stores, a small shop selling plants, etc. So effectively, you solve the problems and you allow possibilities. And in a way, I think if you do that, that's maybe all architecture needs to do. It's one image of the proposed space with a huge demonstration, because this area in Brussels is lost to the public. It's the most democratic place in Europe, theoretically, and nothing is public. We also did a square very close to the School of Architecture, the Roger Plain in Brussels. This is just one photo. I think this was the Red Lions hockey team, which won in Tokyo, and this is them celebrating. So this space, this public space, there's a canopy which creates a sort of signal point, but allows the possibilities for public gatherings. It's public space. I think my last one is then just one other example of work that we're doing in the office. And we're doing a lot of projects in Albania, in Vlora. And what I think is incredibly appealing from what we're doing there and for the administration in Albania is that the first thing they do is they created public space. They said, we'll create a landscape. and that landscape will be public. And so we created a waterfront landscape of several kilometers. And then, as opposed to cities like Monaco or even London, where that would be only for the very rich and for very expensive apartments, we've really put things like a football field. So now you can play a football match looking out over the Mediterranean. So I think there is something about this public space and what you can actually achieve with that, and how architects, everything you do, I think to an extent is political. I think we live in a society, and when you create architecture, you're creating a political statement. I think that's my last slide. Find out. I go one forward. Yeah.
Well, maybe it's quite obvious, but in the former image, you have the very limited means that are used to, at least that we can see in the picture, to make the space happen. It's a line of trees. It's not exactly a line, if I looked well. And then, of course, you have the sea in the back. And also the soccer field is marked by the poles of the fence around it. And in fact, it's with this very simple means, the space is set in a way. And I thought it resonated quite well with this series of 3 images. It's a project that we are doing at AgwA in El Salvador. It's a memorial for a site where there was an important massacre in 1980. And we are developing there a memorial site, so the people still gather 40 years later each year to commemorate the events and to come together. And so it's a very wide landscape. It's along a river. El Salvador is quite mountainous, so you have these fields, you have the forests, the hills, but there is no real way of defining a place. And so what was proposed was to create a kind of public square, making use of flame trees. So these are trees that have red blossoms, and they lose their leaves and they become completely red at the time of the commemoration. So that's a nice coincidence because of the symbolic value, of course. But it's a very simple setting it's a grid of trees, and then there is a square in the middle, which is also letting leaving the terrain as it is, to not modify the ground, but just circle it with these trees. And then below the trees, you have the infrastructure, a roof, because it's the rain season, some benches, simple things. And this is something that seems to happen quite a lot in projects we do. This was a competition we lost, AgwA together with Dogma, for a master plan and the public space in Kortrijk. And there was some uncertainty about the buildings that could be built around this public space. So what we proposed there was from the beginning, to set a very clear public space surrounded by columns. So the space was defined, and what would happen behind it could evolve more or less freely. This is a footbridge. The construction site is starting now in Serran, in which it was asked to connect the upper side of the city with the lower part and to bridge the railway. So in fact, the question is about, let's say, 40 meters of length. But what we proposed was to do such a simple design that we could stretch the footbridge on a distance of 300 meters. And so it really connects the higher neighborhood with a park which is along the river Meuse, the Maas. It becomes also a kind of simple line in the landscape, which is connecting but also dividing, becomes a kind of and provokes the the identity of the public spaces around it. This is a series of pictures of a sports center in Péronne, nearby Tournai, Dornic, in which we have a series of buildings, and similarly to the project with Dogma, all these buildings, they are connected with a pontoon, that's the right word, which is covered with a simple series of columns and a roof, which is moving a little bit, the roof, but the columns are quite strictly on the same module, and so it flows along the buildings, it connects them all together, and of course it throws you back towards the broader landscape. It's up to you.
Okay. It was for me quite appealing that many of these images dealt with this sort of architecture as a framework for things to happen in them. So I mean, in a way, very often it's not specific, it's not incredibly obvious that this is a type of building, this is a museum, this is an art gallery, this is a house, this is a swimming pool. I think the architecture is a sort of framework that allows a sort of containing of both landscape and activities. And I think that's when architecture is sometimes at its best, because it removes itself from discussions of style and taste and period. And I think that's what I saw in these images, a sort of a framework containing different functions and different landscapes. And that put me in mind of this image. I'm assuming if there's 17 or 18 architect students at the other end of this internet call, then you probably know this one. It's not an exam. This is Le Corbusier's domino system. I was always shown this image and taught it as a sort of tectonic image. It's about using the concrete system of Hennebeek, and it's about freeing space, it's about freeing the facades. But more and more, and also, in all honesty, as a response to the images of Harold, I actually looked at it as a spatial, it's about space, it's holding space. And suddenly the fact that it's made of concrete is a byproduct of the space it creates, rather than the structure being the defining point. I did go to the Biennale in 2014, was curated by Rem Koolhaas, and it was called Fundamentals. And I think there's a slide later, which I'll show, but they built a recreation. The students from the AA built a one-to-one recreation of the domino outside. So it became a sort of pavilion, it became a space. And because it was temporary and because they had a limited budget, they didn't build it in concrete, they built it in timber. So in a way, it was divorced from the tectonic requirement. I mean, the tectonic system which Le Corbusier invented wasn't required. They built the building in stressed plywood and in timber. So I think environmentally, let's say, its footprint was much less. It's exactly to scale. This is a photo from the Biennale, not by me, but I was there. What I found hugely appealing with this structure is how much it was used. It was the simplest piece of architecture in the Giardini. If you go to the Giardini, it's a wealth of architectural style and pomposity. Every architect over 100 years has tried to outdo one another. And every building is closed, and every building has a front door, and every building is heated or cooled. And this was one of the very few structures there that allowed people to get out of the sun, to meet people. I guarantee you that when people were getting lost their kids, they said, go and meet there, and the kids would be playing on the top floor. So it's unbelievably simple, but it allowed all these things to happen. And it's a framework. I mean, it has the discussion of style and the discussion of taste, I think, isn't really relevant to it. It became a space to allow certain things to happen. This then links to, I suppose, in some ways thematically to some projects we're doing in the office. If anybody was listening to the or attended the lecture that Xavier de Geiter gave at Beaux-Arts a week ago or 2 weeks ago, then you've probably seen this project, so I won't go too much detail at all. Again, it's in Albania, again, it's in Vlora, it's a competition, it's an existing building. So everything you see, the tower, podium, and the tower is an existing building at this stage. It was an illegal building, built and then stopped by the authorities, who then plan was to knock it down. It faces a large public square, and the competition was for the site. But we decided that it would be better to keep this building and use what we had. This is a photo of a sort of public day in Vlora, and the building was open, and then everybody could get onto the building. And I mean, it was a huge inspiration for our final project, because you can see that this structure is inhabited. And it has some quality. The structure itself has some quality. The scale of the spaces has some quality when it's not filled with technical spaces that no architect wants. And the use of the building, which when it was first proposed by the developers was commercial, but the city want to make it a building for the society. So it's a development center for Vlora. So it'll have public functions, small public functions. And our plan is therefore to keep the structure and to build everything within it. And the distance between what we build within and the existing external facade structure is then public promenade. It's a route going around the building. And that includes going all the way to the top. So suddenly this building, which has a tower, becomes an incredible public route, somewhat like the Maas, you could argue, in Antwerp. But here it's the chances that we are going to do some public function, the normal people of Vlora can get this incredible view over the city and over the Mediterranean. I'll very quickly, I think this project is hopefully known by some people, but I think it's similar. It's about capturing space in a frame. Sometimes it's our project for a school in Ghent, the Melopy School. This is the playground. It's 50% playground, 50% classes, and 50% playground are stacked as architecture. And what I like about it is that in a way, I don't really know if it's architecture or not, but let's say it is. Another view of it. And so it's become almost outdoor room. It's almost perfect. Idea is outdoor rooms, and in a way the architecture is almost not present. I think it's really just about the functions and about how you get to them. This is an image related to that. This is Savile Row. It's the Beatles rooftop concert from the Let It Be album. I think it's now, what I liked about this is that this was a free concert. The Beatles were finishing and they said, we're going to give a concert on the roof of Apple Records. Apple Records are not connected to Apple computers, by the way. So on top of Apple Records, they gave a free concert. So everybody in the street could listen to it, all the people in other office buildings. So in a way, it suddenly made a rooftop public space. And what's very sad is Peter Jackson, the Hobbit man, has now made a film. And to watch the film, you have to pay €5. So you have to pay €5 to stream a film of a concert which they made was free. It's ludicrous. Anyway, I guess the music probably isn't as good, but this is back to the project in Melopy. This is a class concert with the children on all the different levels. It's actually a still from a video. But I think it's really beautiful because suddenly this space, which is outside space, but engages in the public, or there's a public route which goes through, suddenly can become a room, as opposed, I mean, you pull a piano out and suddenly it becomes something else. It becomes a theatre. It becomes almost like a kind of Shakespeare theatre on multiple levels. So I think it's very engaging to see how little sometimes you need in architecture to create architecture. Have I gone too far?
No, it's okay. No, it's funny because I think that what I saw in the images is it's different from what you are telling. So that means that when we did this ping pong game of images, we interpret these mute images in some ways, and then we construct something on top of that, which is at the same time related, but slightly different also. So that makes it quite interesting, I think. No, what triggered me in this sequence of images is that you have, of course, the fact that these are quite raw structures that are inhabited by people that just go there. It's difficult to understand what is the purpose of this kind of space. Like the rooftop, it's also not really meant to be there. And then the building in Flora, which is an existing structure, it's also contentless in a way. And so the fact that you give it back, or that you consider it as the base of a project, is also inviting some kind of unexpectedness in a raw structure. And this rawness, of course, this project here is it's very precise, and it's, of course, a finished object, but at the same time, you could imagine that it's still the construction site when you see the images. You have the naked steel structures and the floor, and then some fences, and we don't really know, is this a final fence, or is it a kind of eras, this kind of fences that you see on the construction site. And this, and then the context also is quite rough in the end. So it made me think of a series of pictures of construction sites. It's maybe an anecdote, but we have at the office a kind of splash screen that we use as the home of our navigators, in which we have some practical links. But then also on this page, we can access the intranet of the office. There is some links to the train, Belgian train website, and so on. And then there is also, we made a small script in order to have collections of pictures that we can change, thematic pictures. And so we ask collaborators or ourselves to provide collections of pictures that we just share with the office, no comment. So there is something a little bit similar to what we are doing tonight. And here, so you see the title says it's Thomas Montulet, who proposed to have this series of pictures of construction site of buildings that we know as finished objects, and then we see them during construction. At this time, when this collection of pictures was made, we just had edited a book on the work of the office, but only through the lens of pictures of the construction sites, no plans, no pictures of the finished buildings. So that's Lina Bobardi, the Kunsthal in Rotterdam. And it's quite funny, I think, to see the energy that you feel really in this construction site. It's maybe because of you still have all the promises of what could be possible with the building, which maybe when the building is finished, well, you have one modality of what the building could be that is realized, but you lose maybe a little bit the imagination of what else it could be. The roof of the Neue National Gallery, which I did not know was built on the ground and then lifted as one piece, quite incredible. The dialogue of the Boerentoren in Antwerp with the cathedral. And then, of course, these structures that receive a skin at some point, which is sometimes in total contradiction with the construction itself. The context, of course. This I could not avoid. It's the very end of the construction site of the exhibition palace in Charleroi. You see that they are still working on the roofs on the right and center too. And the center part is where we have removed all the facades to make a kind of stacked public space. The Smithsons with the timber work. something very rough and very simple. You really understand how the things are built, and sometimes it disappears a little bit after. And this one is the one I find most incredible in the series. It's a house by Adolf Loos, and we all know the pictures with the nice natural stones and the woods, and everything is very detailed and very carefully crafted, and it's a very beautiful and refined interior. And then you see the construction site, and it seems nobody cared about how it was built. It's very incredible. I think the concrete, the bricks, the blocks, it's like all thrown there to more or less create a kind of shape. But at the same time, you have the same kind of tactility, of quality of the textures, and the diversity of materials. And you could imagine also the colors would have created a kind of incredible play in the house. Yeah, maybe just to a kind of love for the unfinishedness of things when you should stop the construction site and say, that's it, let's inhabit it now.
They're really nice images. I must say that the one of the Smithsons is great. Really, yeah. I think I remember when I was and I didn't put an image. It's my first image in this response because I really liked this set. And it sort of went off in a different direction. The first thing I thought to choose was, I can remember when I was at university that Frank Gehry was just becoming very popular, and his first buildings are absolutely amazing, and they're incredibly raw. He started off basically hating the fact that he built beautiful timber buildings, and in America they build in a balloon frame, so it's kind of timber frame structure. And then what would happen is that people would come and they would clad it, they'd cover this beautiful structure up, and he hated it. So his first designs are incredibly sort of raw. I mean, there are construction sites. I mean, it's only latterly that, I guess as the budgets went up and his interest changed, and I don't know. You can ask Frank Gehry when he gives his lecture, but I thought it was really interesting to see those first buildings were so appealing. I mean, I always think Frank Gehry's house and his kitchen is just, it's the most beautiful kitchen I know. The kitchen, the way that the light comes into Frank Gehry's kitchen. I mean, I would happily have dinner with him anytime. So I thought this idea, this sort of beauty of how things are put together, I guess, also links to the craftsmanship engagement, which I like. And I think the other thing is it's just style is really the least important thing that we should be talking about, because how you put things in structure and material is what we have to, these are the things that we have to work with. You have to work with structure. I think even program is tertiary. And I think if we want buildings to be living for a long time, then the program will most likely change. But what doesn't change, I think, is sometimes structure. So I think structure becomes a really important part in how you read and how a building spatially works around the structure. And again, I mean, I use the Villa Mueller in some examples about ground plan in a student exercise, but I've never seen it indeed in the state. It's very nice to see. So that my first image is a sort of response, and I think it could have went in many different ways, but this was one I found really appealing. This is again from Rem Koolhaas's Biennale in 2014. So the title was Fundamentals. And so things like he literally took what are the fundamental parts of architecture, door, window, ceiling, floor, all the different parts. And he kind of explored what they were, what they used to be, and what we do now with them, and how much architecture is lost. And I think that's really true. I think a lot of the times the heroes that we have in architecture, we are working in a different, in many ways we're working with a different set of tools. And this is an example of an installation to show this issue. So for 1,000 years of architecture, the ceiling was the most beautiful surface. It's a surface where you explained the quality of your building, where you put all the money, you put the paintings, you had the frescoes, you had the vaulted ceilings, the express structure. And we had that for 1,000 years or more. And then about 40 years ago, we lost it. We gave it to techniques. We gave it to services engineers and ducts, and then we lost that surface. And I think you can argue that we've done that also with other parts of the building. I like a bit of self-critique. This is a building that I worked on, in fact, as project architect. I don't even think it's a particularly bad piece of architecture. It's in London. It's 15 or more years ago. It's a residential tower, and it's in brick. And so it's 14 stories high and it has brick cladding. And I think it's of its type. I think it's actually quite a good building. It's won quite a lot of awards. But what was a revelation to me when we were doing this building is that the metal supports holding up the brick on this building cost more than the brick. So as the facade, you know, you have a cavity wall because we have to, because now we have to separate everything. And as the insulation gets thicker, the gap between the structure and the cladding becomes greater. And in the end, we had a building which I just found ludicrous, that the hidden steel inside the cavity cost more, was more percentage of the budget than the brick. So 20% of the budget of this building has no benefit to anybody who uses it or sees it. And I think so for me, it was a sort of ludicrous of where are we going in architecture? I'm not saying we're going here, but this is an example of a building from XDGA, again, one I worked on maybe 10 years after the building I just showed you. What I think is interesting, I mean, it's a very specific piece of architecture. It's a Vinci house. It's a photograph in construction. What I like is that the interior is very similar to what you're seeing now. This is a photograph with plastic instead of windows, and there's no flooring, and the ceiling is the ceiling. The only thing that really changed when it's now built on the interior is the fact that there is a floor. There's a raised floor with carpet or metal or stone. The ceiling remains the ceiling, the walls remain the walls, and the plastic is replaced with glass. But the quality of the space is entirely defined by the structure. And I think there's a degree of craftsmanship, because in a way you create some beautiful corners where they really have to work beautifully with the material, in this case concrete. I think I wrote 36%. We had to work with, at that time, which I think was different now, but we had to work with a facade which was no more than 40% opening. So that's an incredible restriction in architecture, but I think there was ways to use it. And the triangle for us was an interesting option because structurally it worked perfectly, but it also gave us much more daylight through the shape than any other window form. So it's not although I think it has a visual choice, there is many other reasons why we chose the triangle. And you see it in other views. And the facade then, for us, there was no option in a tower to choose a heavyweight facade. So all the sort of even stone except would have been phenomenally expensive, because suddenly the material to hold the stone up would have cost more than the material that you want to show. So in the end, we went for a much lighter, these are little glass tiles. I asked somebody in the office to calculate, there's 9.7 million of them, and they're put on by hand, not individually. It's not the pharaohs. They were in sheets, but I mean, they're still crafted and they're still put on by hand, and they have some depth. Here's a photo of them closer up. And what I really like, I live quite close to this building, is the building does change. It looks very, very crisp and very flat from outside, but it has this sort of odd depth. It's a little bit, and this sounds very fanciful, like a Rothko painting or a Matisse cutout painting that has some imperfection and it has a sort of depth. And so when the light hits it, you kind of, the glass reflects and you have this little bit of depth. But yeah, I thought this idea of the building and the cladding and the facade. And another thing, a reason I wanted to show this is, oddly, and it's a critique I find of people, I know so many people have comments on this building who have never been inside, which I find unbelievable, that we can got to a point in architecture that I understand that buildings sit in cities and understand that buildings have a sort of role in a street. I don't go into every building I see, but to sort of evaluate a building before you know how it works as a space inside is very strange, because this is it's a a Janus sort of building. It's the inside is different than the outside. The inside is heavy and thick, and the outside is flat and thin. But that was my last response.
It's an anecdote, but we had a construction site not far away from this construction site. This was almost finished and we were starting. And so we were going from the train station to our construction site nearby the building, and we said maybe we can just go to have a look. So we were there on our foldable bikes, stopping there, and there was a guy also on a foldable bike looking at the building, and he was a landscape architect that we worked together. So it was a kind of meeting point just to look at the building being constructed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could not avoid to just show this. It's I think it's 2010, and the competition it's in 2011.
Yeah,
I think. But in fact, it's a small model that we made for an open competition we participated in for a very small wooden outlook tower in the Limburg. And it's in the end we didn't do this, but the small scale model stayed there, and then we had this very small plastic object at the office, and at the time 2010 the office was starting, and so there were some projects, but there were also times in which there was less work. And so as a kind of game, we started to introduce this small scale model in a set of different contexts. So there is no interior, but it's just an exterior. It was a kind of game at the office. We put that on the first page of the website, and each week we would have a new image of a new context. So here you see the tower in the background, of course, and then it's also on as a scale model with this kind of gap. It was placed in absurd context. It was a little bit meaningless to do that. It was quite funny. But each time also, when you look at the image, it somehow it fits. You say, yeah, why not? In the end, it could be there. And this, I think that's maybe, there was maybe some kind of superficial reflection in doing this, is when you do, we have the tendency maybe to propose kind of mute structures that just are there available for use, but which tend not to be too expressive in a way, which we recognize also in what we have seen before, no? The lines of trees, the lines of columns, the framing of activities, but not being kind of illustration of what it is. And then the question becomes not that much how you articulate the architecture to a context, but how you place something that has a kind of independence in a context. So I can go back to a series of pictures of construction sites, because that's when you see the structure of things. A small youth house in Forêt, which is placed between two other buildings, and it's the simple stacking of levels. It's a split level system, but it's completely independent from what happens on both sides. But at the same time, it finds a place there. This one is in Saint-Gilles, the ECAM project. It's a series of buildings creating also a public space in the interior of the building block. And this extension is also a kind of object that you could displace or place anywhere, because it has this kind of interior strength. No? It bears its own rules in how it is made. And then it's just carefully placed in the prolongation of another building that you don't see here. So it's a matter of placement, maybe. That's the construction site we were heading to when we stopped at Provincias. It's a school in Antwerp, a very heavy neo-Renaissance style architecture, and we were asked to do the missing. It has like 4 arms, but one of the arms is missing, so we had to build the missing part of the school. And what we proposed instead was to build a cube, which was rotated on a basement, so it creates relationships in a different way and very diverse views on the context also. So the way this object is placed on the site from the interior creates a kind of relationship with its context. And this is Perron, the sailing school that you have seen before with the very light steel structure. And in fact, it's the same. These buildings, they are just kind of very strong blocks that are placed there. The facade is lifted from the ground, so there is nothing between the landscape and the interior space. And then it's just a matter of placing it on the right spot. I think that's the last one. Ah, no, that's here. That's maybe a kind of a twist because, of course, this kind of independence of the architectural way of developing something or of the structure work for the architecture as an object that you place in a context, but also in the framework of the space we are in right now. It's a little bit different because the context is the building, or the building is the context. And so the architecture is something that is invited into this smaller scale context. And maybe then what happens is that the way you interact with the building has the same kind of independent readability. You can understand the idea of the wooden structure as something that works in itself, that has its own recognizability, and then just positions itself towards the building. I think that was the last one.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd two, again, it's a pity, I almost wish I'd done the two. I had 2 choices now. This is the last image. I thought it was good to top and tail the lecture. So in a way, it started with one image by an artist, and it's now ending with another image by the same artist called Matta-Clark. I think in some of your images, and when these sort of buildings where they're not finished, but in a way, the sort of essence of the building is there. And I know that, I think there's an exhibition just now, but there's a lot of, Bob van Reet used to always talk about the intelligent room. You know, what is needed in a building to make it architecture? What is important? Where is the intelligence in the building? And it tends to be in the structure, and it tends to be in the things which are permanent, and all the things that can go away, the program, the use, some of the materials, the finishes, definitely the techniques. These are not the things that make it an intelligent building. They're just the things you need to make it function at a certain point. So I think that topic is very current just now, and when we start talking about buildings and reuse, and I don't think that should preclude new buildings, but I think buildings should be intelligent. And I think discussing, and we've seen or looking at these buildings, that what I really like, we've not talked once about the style of them or how they look or the facades. I think these are things that you need, but I mean, these are not the fundamentals. This is Gordon Matta-Clark working in New York. A couple of years before the image, or before his work in Antwerp, and it's not dissimilar. It's part of his cutting series. So these are existing sheds. They were due to be demolished. There was a public action against it. So there is a sort of political sphere for this, and it could be discussed in about its societal benefit. But I actually included it because I think it's just phenomenally beautiful. He cut very carefully areas out of the facade and areas out of the roof, and then suddenly you have this dialogue between the existing which has a certain quality. It's an industrial building, but I think the quality of the existing is brought into focus by the insertions. That they're almost like they're actually reductions rather than additions, but by these manipulations. And what I always think with Matta-Clark, it's a sort of extraordinary. It's ordinary, and you've done something to it, and it becomes extraordinary. And I think that's maybe what architecture sometimes can do. It can, I mean, I think building is one thing. I think architecture is a thing which makes it either intelligent or extraordinary. And so I really find it a beautiful image to end on. That was our ping pong game. We can actually have a real game now.
I suppose it's a little bit because of the ping pong game, and we were guided, or we guided ourselves together towards structures, because maybe there is some common interest there. But in the end, the tactility of things and the colors and the materials is what people perceive. And I wonder, well, cannot go back in the images, but you remember maybe the image in which there is a slope and then the structure of the Palais des Expositions, and it's full of colors. So you have green on the ground floor, it's yellow on the upper floor, you have some pink colors in the background. And in fact, we decided to repaint the existing structures, which needed to be repainted and protected in respecting the current colors that they had, because the building was divided in lots of fragments. So there was a tennis court on the ground floor, there was some exhibition hall on top, and then there was a fireman station on some other place, and so everybody painted the rooms in different colors. And to reveal that, it's also somehow meaningful. I don't know, if it would be entirely white, it would not be the same building. And so of course, it's about the structure and about what the structure affords and makes possible, but maybe also the way this is expressed has some kind of importance. In the Melope school, we always see the front, the courtyard, and then they say that there is a school in the back, but we don't see that. Or I mean, the images that are really in the public, it's really the kind of big facade of the courtyard, and that bears the identity of the school also. So that, yeah, it's a structure, and at the same time, it's an appearance also.
No, it's true. I think the danger is with things. I mean, I find that the term intelligent ruin, I mean, in some ways I like it, but I also think it's incredibly dangerous because it's seductive. And I think architecture has many more things to do. And I think indeed, how you bring them forward. I mean, I can imagine going into this building and putting a beautiful green velvet curtain, and it would be incredible, because it would be the dialogue between this incredibly sort of beautiful and lush material against this incredibly raw thing. So I think it can be done in many means, but I do think that the structure and the space are the sort of fundamental things, and then you work with them, and that's what I find it very interesting. Actually, if we're now talking to students, that's what I find it very interesting with students, because the discussions on, let's say, the expression and appearance of a building, I think is hugely relevant for architecture, but I think it can also be quite personal, and I think those can work in different ways. But I think the fundamentals, I mean, I suppose it's the thing that Cola said, I think these fundamentals of what have we got as architects to work with, I think they're important. I think that's what we should work with. It's like going to an art gallery. I always find if somebody walked into an art gallery and said, walk through all the kind of existing, 15th century, they walk past Vermeer, they walk past Van Eyck, and then they walked straight, and he could, oh, this is dreadful, dreadful, dreadful. And he got to the end and he saw Roscoe and he went, oh, that's fantastic. I hope we would all think that that person is an absolute idiot. I think architects sometimes walk through or pick up books and look at buildings and don't like what they see in its sort of outward appearance. Oh, dreadful, I hate that guy, hate the architect, and they get to something they like. I mean, that's a ludicrous way to be. Architecture is more than the skin, and it's got to be. And therefore the sort of debate, which I think is more now, I find, in architecture than it was 20 or 30 years ago, even, strangely, of how it looks. These are not unimportant, but I think there are many possibilities. But I think when you look into issues of sort of, even on issues of like society, and I think definitely issues of durability, because I don't think the answer for me is, you know, higher insulation values, how buildings last and what buildings should be in the fabric of a city. I think these are the sort of fundamental things that you have to solve. I think structure, I mean, and when I say structure, I mean space. I mean, I don't literally mean a column. You know, I think it's not a column. It's how do these spaces link one another? How are they linked into the city? How are they, who uses them? How can they get through them? I think that's it.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
keep going, guys.
In the studio, in the master dissertation, we are working on the current tenders of the Brussels master architect on social housing. A couple of years ago, they would have all been demolished and reconstructed, and now it's quite a lot about maintaining these buildings. And many of these buildings are from the 60s, 70s, so with issues regarding insulation. And that's really a skin problem, because if you are asked to insulate the building and you don't think about it, you are just replacing the identity of an architecture which is as a kind of attitude which is very clear back then in the 60s, 70s. And then now these buildings are reskinned and they become a kind of trendy, white, shiny something. But it's awful in a way. And so the question of what do you do with the skin of such buildings is of tremendous importance, I think. And then, of course, it's not really about the inside, because sometimes even in the competitions, it's not about rethinking the houses, it's just about insulate the building. And then how do you do that in an intelligent way in order to reveal the architecture, but at the same time, probably recladding. And so there are questions that in which the skin is quite fundamental. And it shows also that a facade and another facade is, they really make the difference also. A wrong facade is a big problem for the architecture too.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the facade is often, I mean, it's a dialogue. It's like going to a meeting and wearing a suit. It's a dialogue often with the city. And I mean, if you live in Brussels, I live in Antwerp, I've probably been in less than half of 1% of the buildings in Antwerp, and less. I mean, I've probably been in 100 buildings in Antwerp, and there's maybe 20,000 buildings. I mean, and so I mean, of course, my relationship is often with what I see of them, but I think actually I still tend to believe, let's say, before that happens, I think it's, let's say, that building's where it sits, what it does with public space, its scale, its relationship to the neighbours is sort of fundamental. And I think its skin is that sort of handshake, and I think it's important, and I think it places it in a context. But I think for me, it's a. I don't want to critique anything, but let's say it was interesting for me. I'm going to have to do. How many people are listening? Maybe I'm allowed to critique something. This is never a good idea. I showed the Koolhaas Biennale thing, and I thought, I mean, I tried to go to as many as I can. I mean, sometimes they're a bit of a kind of beauty show, but I think that was a really so obvious question to ask about how do we deal with all these different things in architecture, these elements which we have. And then I went this year, or I saw the exhibition this year, and I think so much of the exhibits were about what things look like. I mean, literally, there was about what they look like. It was the first 20 centimeters off a building, and that first 20 centimeters is in some ways temporary, and is in some ways tertiary, and in some ways not even real. I mean, I entirely believe that these are important. I mean, we never would try to do a bad facade. And I definitely can go down building and say that's a horrible, unattractive, it's not beautiful, it doesn't work, whatever. And I think, if I'm being very honest, I'll say it from my side, I think facades are sometimes one of the most difficult things, because you almost have to set yourself into a certain context of what you believe in rather than what you do. But I think it's a dangerous debate sometimes to get into, not dangerous, difficult debate to get into the look of things. Because I think in architecture, we should be, as a sort of debate, be discussing things on a bigger level.
I agree that it's very hard to think a facade, and that's also, we see that it's a little bit an issue that we have at the offices, that we tend to try to make good spaces or interesting relationships with the context, and to anticipate change or possible uses and stuff, and to develop a kind of spatial structure. But then at the end, you also have to make it appear. And if you push that as a kind of secondary thing, well, we struggle with that a lot. How to compose a facade, it's not easy.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. I always, are we running out of time?
We're slowly starting to wrap up.
Slowly starting to run out of time. That doesn't make sense.
Maybe we can see if there are also.
Well, I asked if there are some questions in the Q&A, and maybe in the meantime, Patrick can add to the conversations.
Well, I want to intervene in this conversation because I think that the duo worked quite well. I think it's a duo thing. There is a lot of you share a lot of in common as in the way how you position yourself as architect, especially as kind of an attitude. If somehow the thing what fascinates me most is kind of dangerosity. You kind of embrace in a project. It can be playful, but it can really be physical. That things are at stake. Even it starts with Martin Gordon Clark, who is doing this really dangerous things, cutting out structure. But it goes through into indeed also in the political field. In the way how the architecture becomes a promise and not something as a fixed proposal, but something which is open. And you put it, and that's where the duo take place in the background of something which is this kind of permanency, something which gives structure and holds on, and which allows this freedom and this playfulness, this fragility, and somehow I think when I through all these images somewhere, this danger looms on the background. At the same time, you have this kind of this set points where that holds the things on the same time again, and there's the tension between these two, nearly all the images, which I want to pick up just as something which is in common. But I think I'm most grateful, and I feel privileged to watch this as Thomas in this room, your little cozy conversation, which was on the same time small but big. And I want to thank you. I also want to thank Thomas, who did most of the organization. I don't see a lot of questions popping up. So
no. So if there are no questions, then maybe we can conclude tonight's evening. Yeah. Patrick, you want to?
No, thank you. We'll thank each other then. Hope to see you in the next episode of the Going Public Series.
In a physical place.
Hopefully in a physical setting, but prospects aren't looking too bright on that horizon, but we keep We keep hoping. Be safe, everybody. Hope to see you soon, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you.
Bye to all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.